Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. Today we're going to cover Chapter 5. So in Chapter 4, we were in the 1600s still, and we talked about really sort of the formation of some of the colonies. So, the formation of Pennsylvania and some of the original colonies, and we also talked about the growth of slavery in the South. So we spent some time on that. And so now we're rapidly moving into the 1700s. So this chapter, Chapter 5, covers approximately between 1700 and 1775, although most of it's concentrated in the early parts of the 18th century, which is the 1700s. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about that. Now, just a couple of things to keep in mind. I know most of you know this, but we're not the United States yet. We're not going to be the United States for a little while. So it's still the colonies, and as far as the population of the U.S. is concerned, it's still all on the East Coast. There's no exploration into the West. There's still Native Americans, everywhere throughout the East Coast, in the South, and slavery starting to grow. So sort of the big theme for Chapter 5, I would say the real biggie, is population growth. And when you go through and read the chapter, the authors are going to talk a lot about population growth, not only from Europe. So, the big waves, the early big waves of immigration in the 1700s really involve Scottish, Irish, British, Welsh, of course, and then also some Germans from Europe. And the interesting thing about that is that in a lot of cases, there's a real need for labor over here in the New World, and plus the fact that the economy, especially in England, was really bad. So it's like high unemployment. People are looking for work, and that motivates them to immigrate to the New World, to the colonies, for promises of a better life and more freedoms, freedom of religion, that sort of thing. So that's one of the big takeaways for the chapter, is this influx of population, this real population growth that occurs in the early 1700s. So keep that in mind. And then also population growth comes from the importation of slaves. So slavery continues to grow in the South, and it's not until 1808, so 100 years from where we're at right now, that the slave trade is banned in the U.S. In other words, that no more slaves can come from Africa. So the population growth is really encompassed both by Europeans and slaves in the South. The other big takeaway with all this population is that there's two sort of revolutions that the book talks about, and they are, I think, on page 128, 129, and one of them is the consumer revolution, and one of them is what they call the industrious, not industrial, but industrious revolution. So I think it's important to think about the consumer revolution as really in two parts. So the first wave in the period we're in right now is that there's this rising of a middle class, and so consumer goods become more important. Prior to this time, the colonies are not as sophisticated, so people did not care about the clothes they wore, the dishes they ate off of, anything like that. And again, even with this consumer revolution, it was nothing like what we have today, where there's mass merchandising. But at the same time, people started to care about how they looked. They started to care about sort of keeping up with the Joneses. Appearances became important. There's a philosophy out there, especially if you study history of artifacts or technology, that the full-length mirror, which was really introduced in the 1700s, allowed people to really see themselves for the first time, and that drove fashion and drove a hunger for different kind of fabrics, different kind of clothes, and also as people became more affluent and started to build homes, as the home goods. So whether it be china or linens, that sort of thing, that the economy really built from this consumerism. So that was one wave, this first wave of a consumer society, and then also what they call the industrious revolution, which basically means a lot of people started working and producing a lot of goods, and that really came about because of the natural resources that this continent has, that North America has for sure, and then also the fact that there was unlimited land. So there was this expansion into farming, some manufacturing. So it really drove this this wave of production. So when we talk about the industrious revolution, it really means industrious in the sense of working, but not an industrial revolution, which wouldn't occur really until the later 1800s in this company as far as industry itself is concerned. So pay attention to that. As far as the economy growing in the north with manufacturing, shipbuilding for sure, and then in the south through slavery, the importation of tobacco continues. Rice begins to be a big export. Indigo, which is a plant, and the dye is used to dye fabrics. That becomes a big export in the early 1700s, and that all comes from the South with slave labor. Now, it's important to understand the concept of mercantilism. So remember, in the 1700s, the colonies still belonged to England, and the British, the French are all operating under this mercantilist system, which means that they're trying to grow their economies to give them more power as empires, as countries. So the way it went in the 1700s is that raw materials would be shipped from the colonies to England, and England would produce goods such as iron and steel and China and fabrics, and ship those finished goods back to the U.S. So keep in mind this mercantilist system, that the worldwide economy was really kind of growing, and the colonies were a big part of that as far as supplying raw materials are concerned. The other thing is, as you read this chapter, you're probably going to notice this juxtaposition, because on the one hand, you have this gentility or this sophistication of society growing in the north, while the slave trade is growing in the south. So the quality of life for people in the north, everybody, even the working class, is improving rapidly, while it's getting worse and worse for the slaves in the south. And the two cultures between the north and the south are so much different, because you have these plantation owners in the south that have their own mini kingdoms, if you will, these big colonial estates, these big plantations where plantation owners are getting really rich from the shipping of rice and tobacco. So that's going on. The other big trends are that you're seeing with population growth, the rise of urban centers, so big cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia start to get pretty big. And there's also this notion of the public sphere that you're going to read about, this notion of the public coming together and being seen as a force. So this idea of the public as a single entity, a lot of that's related because newspapers start to get popular and start to get published. So now all of a sudden there's a public opinion, sort of a grouping of the public, and it's a powerful force, especially when you consider democracy in this country, and it's still the same today. This idea that we, the public, are a single force, and the government, can't do things to us. In other words, that we have rights as well. So this notion of rights, public rights, starts to grow with the rise of newspapers, and part of that is something that is known as the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is something that's going on in Europe in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and it's really this move towards rationalism. So where science gets really important and rational thought gets really important, as opposed to mysticism, for example. So the Enlightenment saw a growth in the interest in science, in the interest of crude research, and thinking in terms of rational. And so this wave of Enlightenment thinking comes to this country. You see all of a sudden the rise of books. For example, Ben Franklin, really thinks about the first library in the 1700s, in the early 1700s. I think there's a passage around page maybe 144, 145 that'll talk about the library, and Ben Franklin. So, you think about that, you can compare books in the library really to the internet, because it's the first time that information becomes available to this public that's growing. So people are starting to get smarter, they're starting to read more, they're starting to learn about more things, and overall society becomes a bit more sophisticated. I know it's hard to imagine because we're drowning in information, but back then, a book was a really big deal because that information transfer just didn't happen. At the same time, you have the rise of newspapers, as I already mentioned. So again, this transference of intelligence and opinion becomes prevalent, and I think that one good way to think about those as we get into the late 1700s is when the colonists start to think independently. A lot of that comes from the fact that they're learning about ideas about exploitation, and ideas about democracy from this wave of information. So I would argue that there's sort of a first wave of the information revolution happening in the early 1700s as well. So that's talked about in the book. So anyway, the big takeaways for this chapter, I would say 1 is population growth, 2 is the expansion of slavery, 3 is this consumerism and this information revolution, or at least the beginnings of those, and also this industrious revolution where more people than ever before are working. And then the other thing you're going to read about that's important in this chapter, along with Enlightenment thinking, is something called the Great Awakening. And you'll read about it in the book, but basically the Great Awakening is this idea that religion is becoming a strong force in this country. You'll read about George Whitefield and some other people that are basically evangelists that travel all through the colonies, speaking the word of God. And sort of the cool thing about that is that the nation is somewhat secular. I mean, obviously there's not one religion that takes hold, and we certainly see that today as you drive down any street and see the grand variety of churches that are out there. That really started back in the 1700s with these different brands of religion, whether it was the Episcopalian or Methodist, or the beginnings of the Baptist religions. You see this grand mix of religions out there that starts with the Great Awakening. So, in our society today, there's this idea that there's a strong push for religion, but at the same time, Enlightenment thinking and rationalism is very strong, and it's kind of a unique mix where people think about the rational, but they also think in terms of religion and the spiritual at the same time. And the roots of that certainly go back to this chapter. So those are the big takeaways: population, for sure, and urban society, slavery, consumerism, Enlightenment, Great Awakening. And just to put things in perspective, so we're in the first part of the 1700s, so we're not the United States yet. We're not going to be officially the United States until 1789, when the Constitution takes effect. And again, just to stack this up, remember those dates that 1776, we're not there yet. That's the Declaration of Independence. And not until 1788 is the Constitution ratified, becomes effective in 1789, replaces the Articles of Confederation, which were in 1777, and we're a ways away from that stuff yet, but I just want to mention it so you can kind of put things in perspective as we go through Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. And also remember that the colonies are really small, so still west of the Mississippi is either Spanish or French territory, depending upon the time frame. The Louisiana Purchase doesn't come until 1803, so another 100 years from where we're at. So keep all this stuff in perspective. We're still talking about a really kind of crude colonial outpost, but for sure with big population growth. So the next chapter, Chapter 6, really talks about empire, and it's going to talk about the British Empire and the French and the battles that are going on there, because what's happening on the world stage certainly affects the colonies. And then after that, we'll get into the War for Independence, or the Revolutionary War, in subsequent chapters. So we're coming along. Everyone's doing a great job. Again, if you guys have any questions or need any help, please let me know. Give me a call on my cell phone, or text me, or shoot me an email. everyone's doing a great job. So again, stay in touch and have a great week. Be safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.